In the last exercise, you learned a little about using JavaScript to create HTML at runtime. Now, often you're going to use a mix of design time and runtime markup. In this exercise, you'll learn about breaking more complex tasks into smaller, discrete ones. So here is a snippet of code that locates an HTML element by ID, finds its inner HTML, and then places a greeting there. And here's code that does exactly the same thing, but does it in two different lines. So why use two lines when one line will do? There's no technical reason, and in fact, most programmers would almost always prefer the single line version. And yet, even very experienced programmers will often resort to using multiple lines of code when one would work. So, wait, most programmers prefer the single line version, but even good programmers will use the multiple line version. That doesn't seem to make any kind of sense. Well, most people who are unfamiliar with programming think that the hard stuff comes from having to memorize syntax, all the weird commands that you're learning that make JavaScript do what you want it to. But that's a misimpression. What's hard about programming is thinking clearly, one step at a time. A programmer may be confronted with the problem of writing code that will let the user drag an item from one position on the page and drop it onto another. There are a lot of steps in that, and they're not altogether obvious. Or consider a simpler example of a shopper who wants to buy an item. Before we do this, we might need to carry out the following steps. 1, check to see if the product is in stock and that we have a sufficient quantity to meet the shopper's needs. 2, check to see if there's any restrictions that might prohibit the user from purchasing. So, for example, is the item available to the general public or just those with a commercial account? Or can the item be shipped to the purchaser's address? Or is there something that would block this? Or then, if the purchaser is a credit customer, do they have sufficient credit to buy the item? So these are just examples, but the programmer has to consider all the possibilities, something we call corner or edge cases, and write code for each case. So a series of steps intended to accomplish some task has a name. It's called an algorithm. When writing an algorithm, it's useful to take one small step at a time. So even a very experienced developer might write very simple code as they're working through all the steps in the algorithm. And then once they've figured it all out, they may go back and collapse those steps into a more succinct bit of code. That process too has a name. When we take code that works and makes it cleaner or more performant, or sometimes just more succinct, we call that refactoring. But that's much more information than you need just to finish exercise 6. So I'll see you in the next exercise.